Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, March the 24th, 2026. Over the weekend, there was a piece in the New York Times. It wasn't really newsworthy since, in a way, it's barely surprising. A warm-up act, perhaps, to the disagreements of the 2028 presidential election. A piece about the rude exchange between Andy Beshear, the Democratic governor of Kentucky, who's supposedly going to be running for president as a Democrat, and JD Vance, of course, who is probably going to be running as a Republican candidate. All sorts of nasty words exchanged between them. Beshear called Vance the most arrogant politician I've ever seen, and Vance responded, or at least his spokesperson responded by suggesting that Beshear was just chasing headlines. One more example, of course, of public disagreement. We disagree very badly, it seems, these days. And it's appropriate today that there's a new book out about disagreeing better by my guest, Julia Minson. She teaches public policy at the Kennedy School, the Harvard Kennedy School for Public Policy in Boston. And she's joining us from her home in Lexington, Massachusetts. Julia, congratulations on the new book. You had an interesting piece in the New York Times, an op-ed piece a couple of months ago about what science tells us about arguing with your father-in-law. I know a lot of the themes in the op-ed are in the book. What advice would you give Beshear and Vance, or at least Vance's spokesperson, about disagreeing better?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure. It is kind of a big day. Glad to be starting it here. We have to think about what people's goals are in a disagreement. And a lot of my book talks about how people are often not very thoughtful about what their goals are. A lot of the time when we jump into a conversation with somebody we disagree with, we think our goal is to change their mind and persuade them and tell them that they're wrong and that we're right and, fight with them about whatever it is, which is a pretty unrealistic goal. Now, politicians' goals are different, right? Their goals are not necessarily to convince the person in front of them. It may be the goal is to, activate their base, or maybe the goal is to grab a headline, right? So I think one of the things that we have to think about carefully is what's the person's goal and what is a realistic goal and what should it be before we sort of start dispensing guidance.
Yeah, I don't suppose Vance would respond by agreeing with Beshear. I can't imagine him saying, yeah, I am the most arrogant politician ever. So let's get beyond Beshear and Vance. Tell me about your father-in-law, Julia. I know you probably don't share his politics. Let's use him as a test case for how to disagree better. Tell me about the story that you lead with in this op-ed.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a great example because that's something that a lot of people have in their lives, right? Is people who are very special to them and dear to them, who they, respect and love, but who disagree with them profoundly on things that are very important. And that could be, politics is the one that sort of comes to mind. And that's the one where, my father-in-law disagree on. But, we also disagree on a lot of things because we come from different generations and we, parent our kids differently and, live our lives differently. And I think people frequently have the experience that I have had where you notice, you sort of become aware of the disagreement and then you have to decide what to do about it, right? You have to decide of like, am I going to go there or am I going to sort of avoid the topic? And I think there's sort of potential costs in both directions, but that's really what the op-ed is about, is having to kind of navigate that choice.
Yeah, and it's a political one. I don't want to just talk about politics, but I know you disagreed on the ICE raids. Is that a generational thing or a political thing or maybe even a gendered thing?
It's not even that we disagreed about the ICE raids. That's interesting. We disagree about, the role of immigration in general. And we disagree, he has consistently voted Republican through his, life. He is a retired Army veteran, spent, 20 years in the military, served in Vietnam, served in Korea. So he is, very, very committed to American values and the American lifestyle, and has sort of sacrificed a lot for this country. I'm a first generation immigrant, right? So I feel like I have an appreciation for the immigrant experience that maybe a lot of people who, were born and raised in the United States don't have. And so our disagreement sort of historically was political. And I know that kind of our ideas about what's the right number of immigrants to let into the country are different. ICE was just another thing in the news that was kind of worth discussing.
You're a first generation immigrant. Where did you come from?
I came from Russia when I was in middle school. I came with my mom to Denver, Colorado.
Wow. And do you, in terms of disagreeing better, do you think the Russians disagree better or worse than the Americans? Are there international differences here? I mean, you're a student, a professor of disagreement and agreement, or is all the world struggling with the same problem of how to disagree better?
That's interesting. I think so in my mind, there's two fundamental problems, and they're almost the opposite of each other. There's one version of disagreement that's not great, which is very contentious disagreement, right? Sort of disagreement that turns into conflict. And this is an important distinction I make. Disagreement is not conflict, right? Like you and I could see the world differently and we could have a totally civil conversation about it. But there is something that we see all the time, and something we certainly see a lot on social media and in the political sphere, where disagreement sort of turns very ugly. So that's one problem. The other problem that is perhaps even more common, but looks very different, is people who don't want to speak up because they're afraid to have that disagreement that's going to turn into the conflict, right? And so those are the folks who sort of are seething with resentment, right? Or feeling like, their voices are being shut out, but they just don't want to engage with the drama. And so both things are not great. And I do think that there are, different cultures where the norms are more direct and confrontational versus kind of more polite. And so, like, depending on where you come from and what you're comfortable with, you're more or less likely to make one error rather than the other, right? So, like, certainly Russians tend to be pretty direct and confrontational in their disagreements, more so than Americans, I would say.
It's funny. I came to this conversation thinking, well, I'm doing this show on how to disagree better, and this is a conversational show. So I thought I would try and disagree as much with you as I could, and take whatever position you were taking. I take the opposite position, which is kind of my brand. Often it's not unusual for me to do that on the show. But one of the things that strikes me is that the more, and I don't know you very well, but even just knowing that you came as a teenager from Russia, firstly, when you began talking, I couldn't really hear the foreign in you. So I was slightly surprised because you sounded American to me. But then once you acknowledged that you'd come from Russia, maybe your accent changed slightly. You relaxed a bit, became a bit more Russian. But whatever the reason is, it made me more sympathetic. And I thought, well, how am I going to disagree with this lovely Russian immigrant now? So my serious point, Julia, is and I know you're a social scientist, could one say, it's probably not true with your father-in-law because you probably know each other intimately, but the more we know about somebody else, the easier it is to disagree better. In other words, and of course it comes to the internet, where we're on social media, we don't know the other person. We're excellent at hating and disagreeing really badly.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. One of the things we talk about, one of the things I talk about in the book is research on how sharing a personal narrative about why you believe something that you believe, and especially something vulnerable about that, right? So if I said, you know, we should allow more immigrants in because as an immigrant, I've had a great success in this country. And because my life is so wonderful, we should have more people who have the opportunity to have this wonderful life that I'm enjoying. That sounds like bragging, right? So that's not helpful. But if I said, as an immigrant, I sort of really struggled through parts of my life and struggled to sort of find acceptance and a place in this country. And because of having those experiences, I would like to give those opportunities to other people and make it easier. That resonates better, right? So that's kind of a vulnerable revelation about why a topic matters to me. And, the thing that's interesting about my father-in-law, you're right, we do know each other extremely well. But, and I think this is very common, when people are busy avoiding a topic, right, they don't actually know why the other person believes what they believe. And instead, what we tend to do is we tend to make sort of a series of assumptions and stereotypes where we like fill in the missing information with, whatever it is we make up in our heads. And so a very common problem of disagreement is that people don't say, well, tell me about the origins of your beliefs. Like, how did you come to hold that view? Because we assume we know, and what we assume we know is negative. And then there's sort of like no point asking.
Could disagreement also, and I'm not suggesting that you and your father-in-law don't like one another, but is disagreement also often when it comes to disagreeing with people you know quite well, and we have all these famous stories over Thanksgiving of relatives, brothers, uncles, parents sitting around and loathing one another, that disagreement is a manifestation of dislike and that we should just accept it?
No, I don't think so. I think disagreement is, so disagreement, first of all, there's nothing wrong with disagreement, right? If we disagree politically, or if we disagree about parenting, or if we disagree about how to run our business, those are actually all sort of good things, right? The reason we have democracy is to enable people to disagree politically. The reason we recruit people with different experiences onto work teams is because we want different ideas. The problems start when I reach the conclusion that only a uninformed, unintelligent, potentially evil person could hold the view that you hold. And that's usually how disagreement becomes conflict. And so when we're talking about those families at Thanksgiving who can't stand each other, it's because they know that the other person has different views and they have reached an assumption about where that person comes from, right? So, grandpa doesn't like immigrants because he's just a racist, right? So you kind of like made up a story about grandpa in your head that probably wouldn't be how grandpa would explain himself if you asked him, right? And so, so I think most of the time when disagreement becomes conflict, it's sort of lack of accurate information.
Is social media and the online environment, is this a cause or a consequence of this epidemic of poor disagreement, sour disagreement?
Right. Why not both? Honestly, so people love blaming social media for this.
They blame social media, Julia. People blame social media for everything,
Yes, it's so convenient. And I do think that social media has a role to play, but the way in which I think it plays a role is it just makes it easier for people to do what we naturally want to do, right? So like long before social media, people disagreed with their parents and their grandparents about politics, and long before even, the internet, right, or any of the modern technologies, you had intergenerational conflict, you had political conflict. There's a very basic feature to human nature where we like agreement, right? When you are in agreement with the group of people you're with, all sorts of, social and emotional benefits flow from that. So we just don't like disagreement as sort of a species. And social media has made it easier to follow those instincts, right? So what we, it's become like much, much easier to only listen to and only consume information that you agree with, because it's, it's just served to you with the algorithm. You don't, even have to make any effort anymore. So it's exacerbating a problem that's a sort of deeply human problem.
I have to admit a degree of ambivalence about books or arguments that begin what science tells us and then ...
Mm-hmm.
Your New York Times piece leads with what science tells us about arguing with your father-in-law. I assume an editor came up with that title. But your book and your professional identity is rooted in being a social scientist. You're a professor of public policy. Do you think that even the idea of science helping us disagree better is, for some people at least, deeply objectionable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. I think, there are people for whom, the idea of science telling them what to eat or what medicine to take is deeply objectionable. But, the scientific method is sort of the best toolkit we have for figuring out things that are true from things that are not true. It's not perfect. And part of what's built into the toolkit is self-correction. But I think especially, conflict is a special thing, because on one hand, we're all like not terrible at it, right? Like you get up in the morning and, you get, breakfast and you get to work, and rarely do you get punched in the face throughout that process, right? You interact with, maybe dozens of people, and somehow you manage to navigate your social world and be okay. So in some sense, we're all quite good at navigating other humans. On the other hand, we are consistently wrong about things that intuitively seem effective. And that's, I think, where social science is very effective, as we can kind of separate the things that, our parents told us that are definitely true and we should keep doing, from the things that our parents told us and happen to just be off.
Does the science, though, and the social science, is it in agreement? I mean, when you look at the stuff on COVID, for example, there are, I'm sure, lots of people at the Kennedy School and other fancy schools that talk about some sort of consensus on the science, but people disagree on that. Is the science in agreement on disagreement, Julia?
Well, we've been disagreeing a lot longer than we've been dealing with COVID. And certainly I think the hallmark of the scientific community is that we get to argue with each other. But
very politely. I mean, in a very scientific way.
You've never read a review letter. We're not polite, or at least not as polite as I think could be helpful sometimes. But, there is no perfect consensus on some things, but other things we can largely agree on. And, that's sort of the purpose of data, right? Like behavioral science is sort of not philosophy. You don't get to make endless arguments. You bring data to bear on the problem. And, if your experiment sort of, tests your hypotheses and is seen as credible by other researchers, then you win the argument, and that's the end of it. We haven't done that for every aspect of human behavior, but we've done it for a lot. And I just, part of the reason I wrote the book is because I think people out in the world don't realize how much research there is around disagreement. And, I kind of wanted that research to get out there.
Julia, we live in a very therapeutic culture, more and more young people in particular. And not only do they feel anxious, but they go to therapists. Often their anxiety is rooted in their disagreements with each other and their parents and the world. How much of this is generational? Are young people, particularly those whose lives, it seems, have been ruined by social media, are they struggling with this? Is it bound up with a sort of a repression? We're doing a show next week about a therapist, a professor, who argues that the problem with young people these days is that they're trying to be perfect. And of course, even the mildest disagreement to some of these kids, and I got kids, can seem like a catastrophe.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think disagreement is stressful. That's the flip side of enjoying agreement, right? And I think that we have created an environment where we don't practice disagreement, right? And I mean, one of the things that you see less and less of is people really, having an argument where they still walk away, as friends and having respect for each other. And I think that's, I think that's part of the problem is we don't have the skills to say, well, I believe this and I disagree with you on that. And let's have a conversation about it. And it doesn't have to be dramatic and it doesn't have to be traumatic. And we don't have to sort of break up a relationship at the end of it. But people are hesitant to have those conversations because they expect a lot of drama. And I do think that that produces anxiety. And I think we do a disservice to our kids by not teaching them to disagree better.
Do you have children yourself?
Yes, I have 3. I have 3 daughters.
Wow, and you had time to write this book. Maybe it was a good excuse not to talk to them. But in all seriousness, Julia, when it comes to kids, there is a power relationship or an imbalance. I mean, is this book designed for disagreements between equals? I mean, when it comes to parents and daughters or sons, at some point, sometimes parents or a good parent has to say, look, I'm older than you, I have more authority, and I'm not going to pay for this. I'm not going to allow you to do this. And it doesn't matter whether or not we disagree. That's just the end of the conversation.
Well, so it's a great question because it gets to this very interesting idea of what power is. And I teach negotiations at the Kennedy School, and we often talk about how your power in the negotiation really comes from what are you going to do when the negotiation breaks down. And quite often, the trouble people have is they overestimate how easily they can sort of shut the conversation down and go off on their, merry way. Anybody who has kids can sort of picture the situation where you say, we're in a hurry. I have to get to work. You have to get to school. I don't have time for this conversation. I'm the parent. I know better. Here's what we're going to do. End of conversation.
Shut up.
Or, put on your shoes and get in the car.
Stop
and
crying.
Then you have like a 7-year-old throwing a hissy fit on the kitchen floor. And half an hour later, that child is still, crying. You're frustrated. She's late to school. You're late to work. And you are thinking to yourself, God, I wish I would have explained to her exactly why Fruity Pebbles are not like a nutritious breakfast instead of assuming that I could just shut down the conversation and go on with my day. So, kids have, and kids are a great example of somebody who doesn't have to be in a conversation if they don't want to be, right? So if a teenager doesn't want to listen, they can just walk out of the room. And if you're a physician and your patient doesn't want to listen to a recommendation, they can just walk out of your office and never come back. And so we have many of these conversations where we say, well, I'm the expert or I'm the adult, and therefore I'm going to get my way. And we don't realize that the other person has the option of just leaving. And if we want to continue having the conversation, then we need to be doing something different.
You also run a lab. You're a consultant alongside your day job at the Kennedy School, Disagreeing Better. So you deal a lot with corporations. You have a lot of private company clients. And I'm quoting your Disagreeing Better website. You know the feeling, the silence, the side eye. Is there a lot of repression in corporations, Julia? I mean, I'm fortunate that I don't have to work in a corporation. I think I'd last about 10 seconds. Is that the real audience for this book? People who work in large corporations, maybe government agencies or IBM or universities, where people sort of dress their disagreements up, or perhaps they repress them?
Yeah. So, again, we love agreement, right? Agreement is nice. Disagreement is risky. And when I say risky, I don't mean some, sort of nebulous like risk to my ego or risk to my self-esteem. But I just know that if I disagree, the conversation is going to be longer. It might turn ugly. I might upset the other person, right? And so as a person with a differing opinion, I am always kind of doing the math in my head. Like, is this worth it? Right. Now, I think we do that in every group. We do that in families. We do that in classrooms. We do that on school boards. We certainly do that at work. The difference is at work, the reason we brought people into the room is because we want to hear their opinions, right? Like the reason you are with your family is because you just got born into your family. Right. And so you might not sort of have an important task or mission you have to accomplish with those people. And so if you don't speak up about politics at the dinner table, there's really sort of nothing lost. Like maybe you could have had an interesting conversation with your father-in-law, but if you didn't have the interesting conversation, it kind of doesn't matter. But if you're in a workplace environment and you're about to make a disastrous decision as a team and somebody has misgivings about it and they don't speak up because, they don't want to be the pain in the ass. They don't want the meeting to go longer. They don't want their boss to be resentful. They don't want to stick out. That's a real problem. And so, companies, certainly government agencies, have sort of an intrinsic need to make people speak up. And that is at odds with an individual's own preference to, keep quiet and, get on with their day.
So what are you saying to the person who sits in a meeting and knows that the team, for one reason or other, is making a really bad call? What should they speak up, especially if they're a junior person around that table?
So this is sort of, an interesting way of thinking about it, right? Is that companies have told people to speak up and speak truth to power and, practice radical candor for
all that
decades.
crap, which you teach at Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School, which no one actually, which has no impact, it seems to me, on the world.
Well, right, because that is something that's good for the company, but is in direct opposition to the self-interest of the individual, right? So why should the person do it? And so I think what we should be doing differently is twofold. One, the leader of any given team needs to be spending a lot more time proving with behavior that dissent is actually welcome. Right. So instead of sort of saying, oh, you need to disagree with me because it's, safe to disagree with me and I really value your opinion, you need to show evidence that opposing views are truly valued. And on the flip side, the person who is sitting there, the junior person who's sitting on their hands, they need to have a way of speaking up that makes them feel like it's not going to cause confrontation and drama. Right? How do you disagree? How do you speak up in a way that's not inflammatory so that you can make your point, but minimize the risk of offending everyone in the room, especially your boss, right? So there's sort of like a whole ecosystem happening of all the people in the room, and they all have a role to play in creating a different environment around this stuff.
In other words, the Steve Jobs strategy of getting all the most disagreeable people and putting them in a building and waving a pirate flag outside that building is probably not very wise.
Well, it worked well for Steve Jobs, right? But what you're doing is
but not for everyone else at Apple who...
Not everyone else, right? And not all the people who might have had a lot of interesting things to say, but didn't want to work in that environment.
And what about the Jeff Bezos 1 hour rule or no meetings rule? Is Bezos onto something too? He doesn't seem to be someone either particularly shy about disagreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of our kind of corporate culture, right, is that being very direct and somewhat confrontational is prized and admired. And those kinds of folks often get to kind of the very top of the hierarchy. And then that sort of propagates this idea that that's how you have to be. But there's, definitely, collateral damage that happens along the way, right? As you sort of make people feel like their opinions are not welcome unless they're willing to, shout over others in order to be heard. That leaves out a lot of people.
In other words, so the Zuckerberg thesis of moving fast and breaking things might not be so wise. Your book is out today, How to Disagree Better. Julia, as you won't be surprised to know, it's not going to get on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Journal, the Wall Street Journal, because there are other events in the world today. Would you like to get your book in the hands of some people in Tehran and Tel Aviv and Beirut and Washington, D.C.? Would that help?
Well, I think a lot of people who are in the business of diplomacy already know a lot of the ideas in the book. We teach a lot of folks in public service at the Kennedy School. And what I found through teaching them is that, people who do a lot of these things naturally are the sorts of people who go into the Foreign Service, and then they're coached and mentored by, senior people and kind of hone their craft over time. Part of what this book is, I think, really useful for is giving a structure and a scaffolding to a lot of those ideas to, help train people up faster, to help communicate about these ideas. So yeah, I'd like it disseminated as widely as possible.
Yeah, using the word scaffolding may reveal a kind of Freudian slip here in terms of public hanging. Certainly Donald Trump is not very friendly to the idea of diplomacy and public service in that sense. The State Department in the US and elsewhere, these are people who are trained professionally in disagreeing better. Is that fair? Are you really just basically making the same argument that diplomats around the world make? Because the alternative, the ultimate consequence of disagreeing badly is war.
That's exactly right. And, certainly, the point that I make a couple of points in the book. One is that disagreement does not need to lead to conflict, right? Which is certainly a point that I think many diplomats would agree with. Another point that I make that's, I think, very important, and there's a lot of social science around this, is that we fundamentally misunderstand the people on the other side of most disagreements. So people tend to assume that their counterparts are more extreme in their views than they really are. We tend to assume that our counterparts are more sort of simplistic and homogeneous in their views. We tend to assume that our counterparts dislike us and dehumanize us more than they really do, right? So there's just like a lot of conflict is bred in misunderstanding. And that's, a lot of the work of diplomacy is actually figuring out what's truly going on the other side and spending the time, hours and hours and days to really kind of test your assumptions and understand the other side. And that's statecraft.
But there are some issues, of course, Julia, where it's not on the one hand or on the other. It's not a matter of agreement or disagreement or seeing somebody else's position. In some conflicts, perhaps certainly from my point of view, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a bad guy and a good guy, or a relatively innocent guy and a very guilty guy. Mm-hmm. And whether or not Putin picked up your book from where you were born wouldn't really change anything, would it?
No, I don't think it would change much for Putin. And again, this goes back to the question of what is your goal, right? I don't suspect that President Putin's goal is to sit down and have a thoughtful conversation with President Zelensky. and, come to more deeply understand his perspective, so that they can have a, nice relationship going forward, right? I mean, the man's made very clear what his goals are, and that is definitely not one of them. So the book is really designed for, people who are interested in having better relationships with people they disagree with, right? And that could be because this is somebody you work with, it could be somebody you live with, or it could be just, this feeling that many of us have that, like half the people in the world are crazy, and that can't be good for any of us, right? And if you sort of examine that set of beliefs and talk to those folks, turns out that many of them are not nearly as crazy as we assumed they were a priori.
Well, this book is not going to be sent off then to Moscow, to President Putin. Let's end on a positive note. What did your father think about you writing about him in the New York Times? And how are your we're still a way away from Thanksgiving, but when you get together with your father-in-law and the subject turns to politics or immigration, are things a bit better now?
I mean, things are great. Things are fine. We talk and we disagree, and I respect him and I love him, and he respects me and he loves me. And it's, every time something happens in the world where I expect him to see it differently, I go through the same moment of, oh, do I want to go there? Right? Do I want to sort of rock the boat? And every time I do, I am sort of pleased to learn something new and interesting. And, I haven't regretted it yet.
And how are your daughters dealing with this book, Julia? Are they, when they disagree with you, when you start screaming at them to put their shoes on or get out of the house because you're late, do they tell you to read your own book?
Yeah. Well, my husband certainly tells me to read my own book. Chapter 4 of the book is about one of my daughters. She, we disagree plenty, and I've learned a lot from those experiences. And I do think that disagreeing with our teenagers is one of the hardest things that we do, and many of us have to do it day in and day out. So.
Yeah, and Julia, I can guarantee you, I've got kids in their 20s. It doesn't get any easier. They're just as disagreeable when they get to their 20s.
Anyway, well, maybe they need the book then.
Yeah, well, I'll probably send it to them, although they'll blame me for it one way or the other.
They can blame me.
Yeah, well, I blame Julia Minson. The most agreeable conversation on disagreeing better. Julia, congratulations on the book. Lovely to talk to you, and continue the good work. It's an important subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.